Let's do a quick test of your audio, Akila. I think we're ready to get started. Perfect. So thank you everyone for joining today. I just wanted to make a quick reminder. Today's webinar is being recorded, so we'll be able to provide the link to the recording after the session today. And my name is Brandy Donini-Melanson. I am a program manager for the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys, which is the agency sponsoring today's training on community-based violence intervention, which is also known as CVI. Today's webinar is just one of 3 sessions planned on CVI. We'll be offering another webinar on August 3rd, and that webinar will provide more information about existing CVI programs. And on August 10th, we'll be covering management of CVI programs, staff, and relationships. So we'll send out a link to register for those sessions shortly. Throughout this presentation, as Lonnie had mentioned for those who were on previously, we'd ask that participants put the questions that they have in the chat box, and then we'll take some time at the end of the discussion to answer those questions. So during the webinar today, the presenters are going to share their experience with CVI programs and talk about what makes them successful, what makes them different than other crime reduction efforts. And really, I think when we think about today's session, it's going to be a big picture overview. We may dive into some nuanced issues, but I think you'll see on August 3rd and August 10th, we'll be covering some perhaps a little bit more nuance. So this is really going to be a bit of an overview. And although today's presenters aren't going to be using a PowerPoint presentation after the webinar today, we'll share some more information on CVI programs through a presentation that'll give you, it'll be a handout that will be useful. And we want to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance and LISC, which is one of BJA's training and technical assistance providers, for helping us secure today's panelists. And so with us today is Matt Perkins of LISC, and he'll be moderating the panel discussion with Dr. Chico Tunman and Akila Sherrill, both whom have a vast amount of experience with CVI initiatives, and we're really excited that they're joining us today. So thank you, Matt, Akila, and Dr. Tunman. I'll turn it over to Matt now.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking Brandy and the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys. I had a list of other groups to thank and people, and she covered them all, as well as kind of some to-dos, which she covered as well. I'll remind you, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. My colleague James Stark will be monitoring the chat and let me know if there's anything to address right away, and we should have some time at the end. Who am I and why am I here? My name is Matt Perkins. I'm a project director for LISC's National Safety and Justice Program. LISC stands for Local Initiatives Support Corporation. And those of us, or those of you who are familiar with our organization, are probably thinking, what is a community development organization doing on a safety call? And LISC has been active in safety and justice efforts for the past 26 years. Most of our efforts really focus on convening collaborative groups to work with city, local, and even the federal government to create safer communities in a sustainable way. And that includes community input and community identification of priorities. We view our work very much as a missing middle when it comes to addressing crime and safety. We have a vibrant network set up for first responders, police, prosecutors, and others who can respond after crime happens. There's a growing commitment nationally to prevention efforts, especially around violence. And so our work often fills a void that focuses on less serious crimes that contribute to violent neighborhoods, and developing not just the short-term responses, but medium and long-term solutions. Part of our work, not surprisingly, brings us into contact with community-based violence interruption networks. And so we've had the pleasure of being able to work with Akila Sherrills, especially our Newark office, and working with the Newark Community Street team, and working with Dr. Chico Tillman with the Police Treatment and Community Collaborative that focuses on deflection and diversion over arrest and punishment. They are far more expert than I on this topic, so I'm going to introduce them really quickly, but then ask them to introduce themselves more fully. To start with Akila. Akila Sherrills is a spirit-centered organizer and activist who has worked for 3 decades to promote community ownership of public safety and facilitate healing from violence in marginalized communities. Akila is the founder and leader of the Community-Based Public Safety Collaborative, which advises, trains local public safety organizations in the methodologies that he has found most effective in helping communities reduce and prevent violence, as well as helping victims heal. This work builds on his work with the Newark Community Street Team, Community-Based Violence Reduction Initiative, which he co-created and directed at the request of Newark Mayor Ras Baraka. That's Newark, New Jersey, not Newark, Delaware, where my brother went to school. In 5 years, Akila led the Newark Community Street Team. Homicides went down from 104 to 51 in the city. Chico Tillman, Dr. Chico Tillman, is a senior research fellow at the University of Chicago Crime and Education Labs and violence prevention expert who serves on the leadership team of the Peace Consortium, the collaborative that runs Fund Peace. Former director of the YMCA of Metro Chicago's Youth Safety and Violence Prevention Programs, is one of the leading national consultants and trainers for violence prevention, reentry, and nonprofit organizations. Currently consulting with Harris County, Texas, Austin, Texas, Cities United, and Life Camp in Queens, New York. Dr. Tillman also served 16 years in prison under mandatory minimums. So welcome both of you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for speaking with us today. And I'll start with Akila. What brings you to this webinar? What brought you to the world of CBI? And please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Matt. And it's an honor to be here with all of you today to share about the work that I've done over the past 3 decades in terms of community-based public safety and reducing violence and crime in urban neighborhoods across the country. Like my colleague, I grew up in the culture. I participated in what many social justice activists call the longest running war in the history of this country, urban street gangs. So I was a member of Grape Street Crip growing up in the Jordantown housing projects. I lost many family members and friends, including my oldest son, to violence in the community. And always, understood it as that gang violence wasn't necessarily the issue, that it was the quality of life issues that actually were happening in the neighborhood that really kind of gave birth to more of the violence. I believe that gangs, the label in itself was given to us to actually kind of like dehumanize the people behind it and desensitize the public to the cry for help that young Black and brown men and women were suffering through in neighborhoods. Our neighborhoods have experienced high levels of traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, and vicarious trauma. And as a result, very little resources was invested in supporting people in their respective healing journey. I had a transformative experience when I went to college that sent me back home, and I organized a peace treaty in my neighborhood that changed the quality of life in our community. And so I co-founded American with Hall of Fame great Jim Brown. We took this work to some, 15 cities across the country before the advent of social media. So we were the cure of violence in the early 90s. And so we've just continued to build on the importance of this work. The thing is that this work is really personal to me because so many of my family and friends are all still caught up in this work. In the violence, and they still live in the neighborhoods in which we serve. And so this is my life's work. I am just excited to be, partnering with folks like Chico, with folks, you know, from across the country who are actually redefining how we actually view public safety. And CVI work is literally now a complementary strategy to policing in communities that are happening across the country. And I'm looking forward to kind of leaning in a little bit more and talking more about that work. Thank you so much, Matt, for the introduction.
Thank you, Killian. Dr. Tunman, please tell us how you got into this work.
First of all, I'm excited about this amazing opportunity. I'm both honored and humbled to share this opportunity to have a discourse with the U.S. attorneys, with my brother Keela, and with you as well, Matt, and the great work you're doing at LISC. I have a triadic approach when we think about community violence. I've been first an individual who have been impacted by violence just by growing up in marginalized, vulnerable communities. I grew up on the west side of Chicago in the Austin community, which is considered numerically the most violent community over the last 50 years. The Austin community suffers from a plethora of socioeconomic woes that contribute to violence. So it helped chart and influence some of my actions because I lived in a state of survival. You pick up certain behavior patterns because you want to be able to survive in this particular space or this particular community. And that's what helped me understand cultural norms, which I didn't know I had adopted. Also, I've done work as a practitioner. So I've been a practitioner with Cure Violence. Many people outside of individuals like my brother Keela, who started much earlier, but many people who started like I did if you started from the 90s on up, you were influenced either by Ceasefire in Boston or Cure Violence, because though if you predate that, it's more grassroots organizations. But to be in a narrow focus with the name we call CVI, under the umbrella CVI, you either came out of those two camps. So I worked at Cure Violence as an interventionist, as a program manager, as an individual that was a senior program manager that ran 26 sites in the city of Chicago, as a national trainer that built out sites throughout the United States, and also as a consultant that helped them look at different paradigms and theoretical perspectives that will allow them to pivot and be innovative as times change. Also, I grew a lot as I matriculated through school, because I began to look at different theoretical frameworks and paradigms and understand that there were different ways to approach violence, and a lot of it depended upon the characteristics of the particular city. Different approaches work better in different cities, and that's what helped me understand that you have to co-create the model and make adaptations with the city based upon the characteristics of the community that's being impacted by violence. So I was able to grow in this space based upon me being an individual that participated in violence and was a victim of violence, me being a practitioner, but now me being a researcher. So those three different spaces allowed me to deepen my understanding of CBI and help me come into this space where I am now.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned local conditions dictate which of the models are most appropriate for your city. Can you talk a little bit about especially models that incorporate street outreach as a main feature? What are some of the different models that we find in CBI?
Oh, there are a plethora of models that involve street outreach. I think one of the challenges is when we look at street outreach, since, as I stated before, Ceasefire in Boston and which is now called Focused Deterrence, and the Cure Violence model has dominated the conversation. However, when you think about a public health approach or either focused deterrence, there's various variations of it. It's a plethora of variations, and the models have really evolved, and focus deterrence and the cure violence model are more the embryonic phases. So really, you take this simplistic part of it and you build or adapt based upon the conditions of your city, but also based upon the data, more importantly, because the data dictates what type of violence, what's the context behind it, historical context. Why is violence spiking? Where is it spiking? So it guides you on how to best approach it, as opposed to taking a template and trying to put circles into square, taking square pegs, trying to put them into circles. So you allow the data to dictate how the model needs to be modified or adjusted in order to best serve the particular community or city.
Thank you. And Akila, what is it about CBI that you would say is different than traditional crime reduction approaches that allows CBI to expand on, I like to use the term continuum of approaches to violence?
Sure. Matt, I would say that that CBI, community violence intervention, is a subset of a larger community-based public safety strategy, right? They used to call our work community violence intervention, street outreach, interrupters. These are components within community-based public safety, right? Which is a multi-pronged strategy that employs residents as public safety professionals, trains them in conflict resolution, mediation, de-escalation strategies, working through a public health lens, to utilize a relationship-based approach to address violence in neighborhoods, right? So the thing that sets like community-based public safety aside from traditional like kind of law enforcement is that ours is a resident in a relationship-based strategy. In Newark, we did a study in partnership with Rutgers and studied, and discovered that 62% of the homicides that happened in the city in 2015 started out as domestic disputes. And so our belief is that if we train residents to stand in the gap, to meet residents where they are, because again, these are domestic disputes that actually weren't serviced. So therefore they escalated and they rippled and they became, homicides in the city, right? And so if residents are trained and they can step in and mediate conflicts, they can provide those wraparound and support services, be it trauma support, be it, recovery and healing support, be it youth programs and services. We believe that that we can prevent victims from becoming perpetrators, honestly, right? So any public safety strategy that you're operating in the community, the center of your policy and your strategy has to be victims and survivors of violence and violent crime. And so we used to believe that an arrest actually ended, the problem in the neighborhood, right? You make an arrest, you put Raheem in jail, it's done. The reality is that that does not happen. There's a direct correlation between what happens in jail and also what happens in the community. You pick up Raheem today, you put him in jail, he can make a phone call and knock somebody's head off in the street, right? And also there's a pretty high threshold in terms of arrest and prosecution. And so law enforcement is not always able to make an arrest. And so when that happens, you have to have residents, folks in the community who are credible messengers, right? Who are non-traditional leaders, ex-gang members, ex-convicts, ex-drug dealers, seniors, folks who are credible messengers in the neighborhood, who can leverage their respect to mediate a conflict to a peaceful outcome, or so that they can buy, the community enough time for law enforcement to be able to gather the proper intelligence and evidence to be able to make an arrest, right? In some cases, arrest is never made, And so what do you do with that? What do community do when arrest is not made? Right? This is why you need community-based public safety as a complementary strategy to policing, not an alternative. We're not trying to replace policing, right? But community-based public safety professionals have a lot more intelligence than law enforcement will ever have, honestly. They are the residents in those particular neighborhoods. And I think that when you couple these individuals with services, as a partnership with law enforcement, you can actually reduce violence and sustain that reduction over long periods.
Great, thank you. And I'm wondering, so I find in my work as TA providers to BJA and OJJDP, much of what we talk about has been studied and developed in urban settings. And we have the responsibility of working in all types of communities, right, including rural, including tribal, including suburban. How do these approaches, how can they be utilized in rural and suburban communities as well, Akila?
So we recently produced a report, about 25 key thought leaders from across the country who are doing community-based public safety work. And we released that report in March of this year, and we'll share that document out. And it's called Redefining Public Safety. And it looked at different community-based public safety initiatives, how they function and operate, from small mom and pop organizations that were started by mothers who lost their loved ones to violence and created like Stop the Violence programs, to large comprehensive kind of systems like Chicago Cred or Homeboy Industries for that matter, right? That are large comprehensive systems with multiple programs and services, that respond to needs, right? This work can be implemented in urban communities or rural communities because, again, it's resident-based. And we partner with organizations like PCITI, the Professional Community Intervention Training Institute, to provide comprehensive training for folks. So this work is not willy-nilly. It operates on standard operating procedures and protocols. No one ever goes into the field without understanding the 4 W's and the H. I'm speaking kind of language that we get when you go through the PCITI training and get that level 1, level 2 certification in conflict resolution, mediation, and de-escalation strategies. These models can be established anywhere. When I was invited by Mayor Baraka to Newark to build out the city's community-based public safety initiative, the mayor expressly shared with me that he wanted me to build infrastructure, put systems in place, and turn it over to the local folks. He didn't want the LA model, he didn't want the Boston model or the Chicago model. He wanted the Newark model. And so understanding the dynamics that happens within the city on the ground, the culture dynamics of the violence that was emerging in the South and the West Ward, where violence was primarily concentrated in the city, we developed a comprehensive strategy that actually met the needs of the residents there. And then we partnered with NPD and with the U.S. Attorney's Office and with, the Sheriff's Department and the Prosecutor's Office as a part of this comprehensive strategy to look at violence. And that, we all don't do the same thing. We see ourselves as a complementary kind of strategy that runs a parallel track around public safety. And in many cases, sometimes we don't share, we never share intelligence with law enforcement, right? However, because it impacts the credibility of the messengers, as well as it can affect the lives of the individuals who provide this service, because we still live in a neighborhood that is extremely violent, right? But what we've been able to do is cultivate a relationship that is so deep with our law enforcement partners in the city that they trust us to call us and give us intelligence. They tell us, because again, there's a high threshold in terms of arrest and prosecution. So they call us and tell us, hey, there's a conflict that's happened between Pilgrim and the 18th Street boys, right? And we know that there's a shooting happened. We know conceivably who is involved, and there's not much we can do because nobody's coming forward to testify, and there's no weapons that we can actually apprehend to use to pin, on a perpetrator. And so they call on us, and we go into the community and mediate those conflicts to a peaceful resolve.
Could I add one thing too? The thing I want to add to what Keila said, it's a science. So that's how we're able to do it anywhere. It's a science, and we have a methodology to it. We would go in and do a crime analysis, regardless of the geographical location. We have to do a crime analysis and look at trends over the last 10 years to see, is it something that happened that's isolated that caused it to spike, or is it a continuum? Have crime always been a particular way in a particular community? Then we do a landscape analysis. We look at the particular area to see what resources are there and what can they be connected to. More importantly, as Akila stated, it's a system. So the system has the ability to be placed in any geographic location as long as the methodology is followed. And once the methodology is followed, we hire the right people with not only lived experience, but community ties and relationships with already intel of the inner workings of what's going on in the city. One of the key things about CBI and what makes it such a great compliment to policing is they know what's about to happen, whereas typically police are alerted after something has already happened. When you live in the community, you know when tensions are flaring, when there's problems brewing, and if you already have those established relationships and the training that we provide, you know how to approach it. There's different scientific approaches to intervene on the violence. So we don't just send individuals. I notice we often talk about credible messengers. I don't want you to think that we send individuals in there just based upon their reputation and relationship, untrained to have these conversations. No, we go through intensive training with these individuals, and we teach them strategies of how to intervene in these particular situations. So these individuals become professional. And that's what we're trying to do, professionalize this field, because they become professionals at dealing with individuals who are at the highest risk, but also at outburst phase. They learn how to bring an individual back down the baseline so that they can give them directives and rationalize with them so they can think through this process and find alternatives to committing a violent act.
Great, thank you. And I go back to what Akila pointed out about CBI must be part of a multi-pronged strategy, right? I think that's especially true in suburban and rural areas where the frequency of violence may not be as much, and where especially law enforcement agencies have, members of those agencies have to be more generalists, right? They have to do a little of everything. And so the CBI programming may look a little different in a rural setting because it focuses not just on violence, but also on other types of conflict and other types of offending. But the methodologies, as you mentioned, Dr. Tunman, are applicable not just to violence, but to other types of conflict, other types of disorder and crime. One of the things that is bound to be an issue in any environment, whether it's rural, suburban, or urban, when establishing a CBI programming is distrust of government, skepticism about intentions. How are community partners able to navigate that mistrust or skepticism? And what are best practices in being able to do that, or critical elements of CBI to be able to navigate that mistrust? And I'll start with Chico.
I'm going to tell you, CBI is a critical component, and particularly right now at this moment in history, because those individuals can be liaison to heal and help repair the distrust between community and police. The way it's structured, typically the administrators and the management, high-level management, do have relationships with police. They have relationships with police. They share intel. They have conversations. They talk about different ways to solve some of the issues. They talk about hot spots. They talk about where crime is actually increasing. So strategically, the people in CBI and upper level management, they talk to the commander or they talk to the lieutenant. They have routine conversations with them. What we don't do is connect direct service providers with them, because it may cause challenges in the community, because what we want is for the community to be transparent about what things are happening, what things potentially could happen, and also how we can support or mitigate potential violent situations and also crime situations. But as Akila spoke about earlier, by having those dialogues and the police being able to share sensitive information with us, we're able to mitigate it because we have those established relationships, and we can have candid conversations with individuals in the community based upon the already established trust that maybe police officers can't. But also, more importantly, everywhere where CVI has been in the United States, police and community relationships have improved. Because what happens is police that work in the community, CVI say, no, these guys really care. They're trying to keep our community safe. And they slowly build them in. And then the police officers begin to build their own personal relationships with people in the community. And it's about consistency. I have to be real. After they begin to see the police and seeing how they work, seeing that they have cultural sensitivity and cultural competency, but also that they care, and all of us want to reach the same goal, which is public health and public safety in our community. And that's how the repair of the breach of trust starts right there. So I think it's critical to bring CVI into the picture to help build and repair the distrust between police and community.
Matt, if I can also just share that one of the things that we did in Newark, a part of our three-pronged strategy, we have a high-risk intervention team. We have assertive outreach workers that do safe passage around schools. They mentor through a case management model. We have a victims advocate, this is a community victims advocate that helps survivors kind of complete their victims of crime application and follow it through to the end. The fourth component of our work is our advocacy work. So we host something twice a month called the Public Safety Roundtable, in which this residents established this literally to pull public safety out of the abstract. Today, you say public safety and people say police. People don't understand, the public's role in public safety, because we've advocated most of our responsibility to law enforcement. And so we put so much pressure on cops to be therapists and teachers and lawyers and counselors. We want them to be everything. And so then we understand why we have all of the collateral damage and unintended consequences that rolls out of law enforcement. Is because there's not a shared strategy and a shared process around safety, right? Law enforcement can't own the public safety, paradigm. It has to be a shared safety process, right? And so the Public Safety Roundtable is a forum that meets twice a month. And essentially, law enforcement gives a CompStat report. The Community-Based Public Safety Organization gives a CompStat report as well. And we talk about issues that are happening in the neighborhood collectively. We celebrate our officers when they do well, and we go in on them, when things aren't correct. It's not a polite conversation. You could actually go on our website to the Newark Community Street Team's Facebook page, and you can see the past 3 years of public safety roundtables. We've hosted the AG, the prosecutor's office, our public safety director, the mayor, as well as all of our community activists and organizers. There's another piece that I think also is extremely important that I wanted to share real quick. That it's growing and it expanding across the country. Equal Justice USA does a training called Trauma to Trust. We implemented in Newark. We trained probably close to 600 officers through the program. It's community and cops kind of going through a 25 to 30 hour trauma training together, in which we get to unpack our personal traumas as well as kind of the systemic issues that impact us in neighborhoods working together. And it's been really, really impactful and effective. And so, I'd like to, to lift up, the work of EJUSA and Trauma to Trust, because I think that it's a powerful tool that actually helps to create better relationships between community and law enforcement. And the final thing is that our high-risk intervention, high-risk intervention team meets every year, twice a year with the shooting team, with our homicide division. And we share kind of best practices, and we talk about, standard operating procedures and protocols. And one of the things that we discovered, in our meeting together, one of our guys who, grew up in the neighborhood, participated in violence as a kid, committed his first murder when he was 14, paid his debt to society, atoned for what he did, and now he was working in the community to try to undo some of the harm that he caused back in the day. But when he heard our cops talk about that they were working 4 12-hour shifts and that we were under policed at the time, so they were just, the homicide division working 12 and 13 homicide cases I mean, just no break. I mean, my guy came to me and said, man, I don't believe I'm about to tell you this. He said, I got compassion for the police. He said, I thought these cats was just parked at the donut place and over here in the cut, like waiting for a call. He said, but then I discovered that some of these folks, man, are risking their lives in the field every day for us. And it actually inspired them in a different type of way to want to be in service to the community, because it's a pretty deep threshold in terms of arrest and prosecution. And so, people harm folks and they're out here in the field, and then we have to deal with them, until law enforcement can gather enough evidence and, to make an arrest. But in the meantime, we got to manage Pookie. We gotta deal with the trauma, and we got to deal with all his associates around them, because these folks are residents of the neighborhood.
Yeah, no, it constantly amazes me the power of partnerships for law enforcement agencies. I got a shout out in the chat from Partnership for a Safer Cleveland. Hello, Dr. Bartholomew. And one of the things that has struck me about the partnership in Cleveland is their ability, especially through Partnership for a Safer Cleveland, to pull different organizations together. And I'm going on a tangent with an example. They were able to work with Case Western University, other researchers, and the Chief Calvin Williams and Deputy Chief Dion McCauley, who has since retired, but to develop a Policing the Teenage Brain training program for officers to remind them how teenagers' brains are different, how they can't respond in the way we expect as adults to orders and conversations, and to help de-escalate situations with teenagers when they're encountering them. Another thing about partnership, and Dr. Tunman might get mad at me for trying to force like typologies on the CBI, because I hear the message, it's dependent on resources. But I want to ask just a little bit about what do different types of CBI programs look like if we force them into categories like street outreach, violence interrupters, and hospital-based interventions. And I think especially hospital-based interventions, what is that about? Something that I don't think is as familiar or gets as much press, but can be profoundly impactful. And I think you muted it, Keelan.
But I was just saying that after Dr. Tunman, I would love to make a comment on this as well.
I think it's critical. Let me start with the street intervention part. I want to look at. First, let me say this. For the best results, you need support from everybody in the ecosystem. The best work I've seen, whether it's New York or LA, a lot of people magnify the work of the street intervention system or the street intervention work, but it's everybody within the ecosystem. And Akila has spoke individually about different pieces in the ecosystem. So it's not just you got a street intervention team that automatically equals success. Now, I would say this. Let me start here. The street interventionist is the foundation. The reason why I say that, because the street interventionist would be the individuals in the community with the relationships. Credible individuals can stop things immediately. So street intervention is at the foundation. I believe the other component that is critical is the hospital. We're gonna look at the HVIP, the hospital. The hospital, what it allows great response on retaliation or intervention, because it's called the golden hours. That's what they refer to it in HVIP. Soon as an incident occurs, everybody from the victim side is there, and you get an opportunity to see who's who and what's the likelihood of retaliation. However, the hospital typically works hand in hand with the individuals that are on the street so that they can help them get intel on how things are moving, and they work collaboratively together. Where the hospital differs is the hospital offers resources to the victim and helps mediate the situation by helping them with resources, helping them with relocation, helping them with the things in order to survive this particular situation. but also with family members and friends. So you're getting a whole different opportunity to do outreach because you have a group of individuals, in many cases, all at the highest risk in a particular space at one time, and they're sensitive to outreach and the literature because right now it's a golden moment. You have everybody's attention. Now, there's other things like victim advocacy. There's other things like employment, housing. All of those things and those continuum of care address the root causes of violence. See, street outreach is one thing, but when you get an individual enrolled in a program, you have to have something to offer them, or else you're just a firefighter. You're stopping a situation, waiting on another one to occur. In order to help an individual with behavior modification, they need intensive case management, but also they need something to meet the needs that's causing them to respond negatively to conflict. Because we know conflict is what normal. It's natural. Conflict is just two individuals disagreeing about something. Now, if me and you disagree over coffee and tea, we don't go to the extreme and talk about killing each other. But a lot of times when individuals have no social capital, they feel as if they're hopeless and have nothing to live for. So the first thing we help with identity. We help with identity. We help with culture. We help with them rethinking, and that's where programs that involve CBT come involved. We help them rethink not only how they think about themselves, but how they think about others. Then we start connecting them to, okay, do you want to go back to school? Another thing we do at CBI that is critical, that's in the whole process, we find out what they want. We don't try and infringe on them. We might think you're great at this. They might say, well, I really want to do this. And we help them with the things they think they need. And then if they have other things, just say hypothetically, they might have problems with substance abuse, but they might not want to stop drinking. We might, work with the things that they feel that are the most pressing needs. And as the relationship builds from a mentor to a mentee, we slightly start saying, hey, in order to maintain a job, you got to work on drinking too. You can't go in, or if there's marijuana use, we say you got to be able to pass a drug test in order to get a job. But first, we meet the immediate needs, Maslow hierarchy of needs, whether it's safety or shelter. We meet them immediate needs, so now we build this trust, so then we can mitigate violence. And in the beginning, I'm going to be honest, a lot of them are still violent because these individuals at the highest risk, but the trust allows them to have an outlet before they commit the act. So they might say, Akila, no, I still have these tendencies. So Akila will say, hey, Chico, when you get upset, would you do me one favor? And I say, what? Call me first before you do something. And I'm going to tell you something that's not mentioned a lot. The main ingredient that Akila and I share that makes us successful is love. We want to see these young guys change their life. And when they see we really care about them, they say, you know what? Before I do something, Akila, you got my word. I'm going to give you a call, no matter how upset I am. And now we have a responsibility to be there for them when they make that call to help detour them. And I think when you think about that whole gamut or that whole continuum of care, you'll begin to understand why each component is so important. It's a network or it's a system more than it's just one component.
Yes, and Matt, I'll just add that a lot of times people couch our work into programs, right? So we talk about Cure Violence Global, and the system that it uses in order to address violence in community. We talk about GVI, which was kind of made famous by David Kennedy and the National Network of Safe Communities. Which is the ceasefire model, right? The stick and carrot call-ins, targeting that 1% of crime drivers in a particular city, but primarily working with law enforcement, to approach, right? Then we have like kind of emerging models like Advanced Peace, which has been instrumental in developing systems-led intervention. See, it's important to talk about the distinction between community-led, or community-based public safety, and system-led public safety. So system-led is offices of violence prevention or offices of neighborhood safety. Those are city-driven strategies around reducing violence for communities. Community-based, community-led are things like the Newark Community Street Team, right? Or like Homies Unidos, in LA, or like Helper Foundation in Venice, right, California, right? These are community-driven organizations that were started by residents in the neighborhood who were potentially or maybe even conceivably be a part of the element that changed their lives and then utilize their influence and relationships to actually reduce violence and crime. One of the things that we're focused on now more as a movement, and this is a report actually that's going to be coming out next week from the Community-Based Public Safety Collective, is that we're looking at what are the elements that actually goes into an effective interventionist or high-risk interventionist or interrupter. We're looking at those types of things, right? We're looking at what makes an exceptional, outreach worker. We're looking at what makes an exceptional victims advocate, right? Because there are about 6 pillars in terms of this community-based public safety or CBI work that I think that we need to really kind of lift up. That literally CBI really redefines public safety, right, into a shared strategy as opposed to law enforcement being a single point of contact for safety in communities, right? That CBS is a profession and that it operates on professional standards. Our work is not willy-nilly in the field, family. That the third pillar is that we believe that violence is a public health issue and that we must, invest in those who are closest in proximity to the issue with the skills, the tools, the resources to intervene, to prevent, and to treat the disease of violence in our communities, right? Is that community-based public safety seeks a holistic need to addressing the living conditions of those who are distressed in community. Because violence that happens in neighborhoods, the underlying cause of violence is quality of life stuff. It has nothing to do with gangs in most cases. I would say 70% of the things that we call gang violence has nothing to do with gangs. It has more to do with quality of life issues and individuals' inability to kind of navigate that system. The fifth one requires meaningful and sustained investment. We have literally funded this work on a shoestring.
I'm going to hold you up because that kind of leads into, there's a comment and I was hoping to set you up for exactly that point. Yes. But in the chat, there was a question from, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, David Alavezos. He asked, also, do you have a list of the major cities that use the strategies discussed in this presentation? It would be helpful to see whether current crime statistics demonstrate effectiveness. And when you talked about, Akila, programs, looking at this as programs, rather than, again, as a continuum of responses, that really hit home with me. We can provide a list of places where these strategies have been implemented. There's a lot of difficulty in trying to assess long-term impact because for the most part, if the program continues long-term, the concentration wanes over time, right? These are treated as special programs instead of a new way of addressing crime or an alternative or a broader way of addressing crime. And so can you talk to that point or others about the main challenges of implementing CBI?
Yeah, well, one of our big challenges.
Yeah, continue right where you left off, I think.
Yeah, it's about meaningful investment and sustained investment in our collective work, right? For years, we've been begging, elected officials and law enforcement to deem our work important enough to invest in as a complementary strategy to policing. Even though our work has shown evidence-based results, community support, anecdotal, I know that we get caught up at sometimes and we're like, hey, we need evidence-based results. Listen, anecdotal, results in terms of this work is just as important as evidence-based things. Understand that listen, evidence-based strategies have been done in our community forever. However, the thing that has never happened is that once they do these high-level studies, rarely do they invest in the implementation of it, right? And so this strategic partnership that we're actually developing with the White House is unprecedented. This national CBI-like initiative, 16 cities in which we were able to bring philanthropy to the table for the first time in a very meaningful way. I mean, there's always been a small group of philanthropic organizations that have been invested in community-based public safety, but we have 30 major foundations from across the country who are investing in this work. It's the responsibility of philanthropy to seed these type of opportunities, and the responsibility of government to come in and take out and invest the long-term sustainable dollars, right? And so our you know, I would say those are the key like kind of challenges in terms of making sure that our work is sustainable, is that that we have to pull this out of community-based public safety work being like this just a flash and something that we do on the side. You know what I'm saying? It has to be incorporated into the public safety infrastructure, right? Every city that has an office of violence prevention, you know, and trauma recovery like we have in Newark, that position needs to be a deputy mayor position. I mean, for it to be seen as a key partner in terms of, you know, city safety strategies, right? We can't continue to leverage all of our personal capital in neighborhoods, you know, to stop violence, to be patted on the head and thanked every year. Like, because we had 10 consecutive years in LA from 2004 to 2014, 10 consecutive years in a row of decreases of homicide and overall violence. And you know what we've gotten? Thank you so much. Thanks to community-based intervention, you know, our city is safe. We got a pat on the head, but these are grown men and women who have children and grandchildren. They need investment. This is not volunteer work. Very much like policing, it's very dangerous, you know, to do this work in the community. And so the Community-Based Public Safety Collective was established so that we can actually now develop national standards and practices in terms of training, but also in terms of investment and pay. You know, if you look across the country, I'm like, you know, in some cities, like high-risk interventionists who are doing this work on the ground like Chicago, CRED is probably paying individuals about $46,000, $47,000 a year plus benefits. An agency like NCST, we're paying people $30,000 a year with no benefits, no life insurance, you know, and people bring the same amount of you know, of gifts and talent and conviction and commitment to this work. We need to establish a national standard across the country to be able to support this work, because essentially, and I'll close on this and pass it to my brother, that when we look at safety in communities, we currently have an instrument that we use that is totally inadequate in terms of like measuring whether or not people feel safe, and that's crime stats. Crime stats says nothing about whether or not people feel safe in communities. We have to develop complementary strategies that survey the most vulnerable in a respective community to better understand like what's happening with them. And then we utilize that as a complement with crime stats. It's almost how like we do our approach to evaluation in neighborhoods. We first do a qualitative evaluation, because we have to tell the stories of the communities in which we're in before we do a quantitative, you know, report. Because although we say that numbers don't lie, you can make numbers say anything if they're out of context, right? And so we've gotten really sophisticated in terms of our strategy and our understanding on how to put together systems and how to partner, you know, respectfully with law enforcement so that we maintain our individual kind of autonomy and authenticity. And yet we actually are able to work together collectively to reduce violence and crime and sustain the reduction.
I just want to add something that complements what Akilah said. If you think about where there's been the most success in CBI, the first two cities that come to mind would be LA and New York, and they have the largest two investments. It's a correlation between investment and success. So, and also, just to add to something else he said, the Fun Peace group is going to Baltimore because we lost two individuals who were murdered during duty. One individual during mediation, two individuals was murdered in Baltimore this year, and we're going to Baltimore in 2 weeks to honor those individuals and also to make a contribution to their families, because neither of the individuals were offered life insurance for the work they're doing. A lot of people don't understand that these individuals are unarmed and are going into situations with individuals who have a proclivity to commit a violent act, have violence in their background, and they're trying to unarm them or get them to disarm themselves, get them to not utilize a weapon. Lastly, I want to say we have to think about what this partnership can do, and that's really what the White House is doing. How to stabilize the partnership to move it forward to create this marriage between public health and public safety to improve the entire ecosystem. Someone asked also if mental health factored in. Yes. And maybe the terminology we used was trauma-informed care, but in order to deal with the trauma, we must address the mental health. Now, what we typically do is, because of the low amount of resources, is that we bring in licensed clinical social workers, as opposed, in some cases, we might need psychologists or psychiatrists, but because of the lack of funding, we use social workers. But yes, mental health is a critical factor because individuals are living in spaces where they're being re-traumatized and re-triggered by living in communities where shootings happen often.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned Baltimore, and Akila had mentioned the danger of the work, so I made sure to pull up the right names. Just want to recognize that Dante Barksdale, who was a fixture in violence prevention work in Baltimore, was killed early in the year. But also, ironically, I followed Baltimore Department of Public Health on my Twitter feed and saw their celebrations for 1 year without a homicide in the Cherry Hill neighborhood. And the next day, I believe it was Kenyelle Benny Wilson, a violence interrupter, was shot and killed. So I want to recognize the sacrifices they've made. And I think it bears repeating the need to professionalize the field, but starting by professionalizing compensation, right? And another part that I think doesn't get talked about nearly enough is the view of street outreach workers in general and violence interrupters and other types of outreach workers as often we find them stuck in a position, right? There's not a career advancement track. And I think part of it is because these workers and people are not viewed as part of kind of an overall violence prevention framework, right? It's a special program. We have to find ways to do a better job of incorporating it into an overall government mission.
Or a public safety framework, I would say, Matt, that it hasn't been seen as a part of public safety. You know, for a long time, they couched our work under youth development. And I'm like, yes, it is a portion of youth development, but this work is public safety work. Because public safety is not just the absence of violence and crime in our community. Public safety is also the presence of well-being in the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their healing journey. And so this work falls in that area.
Great. So I want to get to Q&A time. Would just like to ask for the group, for cities that you think can be looked to as having done a good job of incorporating CBI into their violence reduction work. We've heard about Los Angeles, New York, Newark, of course. Are there any other cities you think our audience could look to for how to do this well?
Yeah,
I would just add. I would add Oakland. I would add Richmond. I would add Sacramento. I would add, I would add New York. I would add Queens, Brooklyn. There are close to 200 cities across the country that are doing community-based public safety initiatives with varying results. Some supported, heavily, and some not supported at all. But I think that there are multiple kind of initiatives that need support. And so this is why we're so excited about this unprecedented White House investment in our work. because now it gives us an opportunity to do landscape analysis in each city, to pull together, the coalition of community-based public safety professionals and law enforcement, municipal services, health, schools, to have a comprehensive conversation around safety. And philanthropy is providing some initial investment. And we can leverage those dollars against ARP monies, against local philanthropy, to begin to build out like kind of stronger systems in each one of these places. Because some organizations might have just street outreach workers. Some might just have interventionists. Some might just have a victims advocate. So we're looking to go in and like helping organizations to organically, build capacity and then provide that TTA support for them.
Great, thanks. Chico, any cities that you would add?
No, I think he hit. I will say this, right? It's a difference. I think some of the work in CBI been politicized, and that's where it's been problematic. Where what I mean by politicized is where they announce or initiate a program without robust funding. It's not going to work. Or if the city leaves it in a silo where they don't have the connectivity to services. So where we've seen it thrive is cities that have took ownership and allowed the CBI to be connected to services to address the root causes of violence. One of the gentlemen asked about what role can the prosecutors play, and I will say in Jacksonville, Florida, and in Washington, D.C., Carver Singh, they actually house the CBI and support it and help facilitate the relationship between law enforcement and CBI, understanding that they have different roles, but they also are a thought partner to help them think through strategy about where they should be, how they should community events. But also it allows the prosecutor's office to build relationships too in the community, because now the community is seeing evidently through their investment that they really care about the community and not coming in just to prosecute for crime or seeing as an individual only that shows up when a crime is present.
Great, thank you. So many things to respond to. I'm not going to be able to read all my notes. I would add Richmond, California is a place that has done some very innovative work under Devon Bogan, who has founded a national nonprofit called Advance Peace. You may want to look at that. That actually involves stipends going to young men involved in violence who stay out of violent activity. Great question here from Brandy, bringing up the topic that I think we almost universally fail to give proper weight when we talk about violence, and that's domestic violence, right? And how does CBI or how would a CBI response to domestic violence look?
Yes, I would start off just by saying that because CBI, community-based public safety, is a relationship-based strategy, we respond to many DV situations because we have a relationship, right? And for law enforcement, they'll tell you that DV is probably one of the most dangerous calls that they actually respond to. None of our work is done like in a vacuum. And we respond to no situation where there's a relationship that's not present, So this is a part of the training. Again, it's a relationship-based approach. In most cases we're kind of like pulling, the male, from the house. We're putting them up literally with our trauma recovery center in some of our in housing, so that we could, work with the with the other intimate partner, with counseling, therapeutic services. There's a new model that's now in 38 cities across the country, actually, that started in California, out of San Francisco, the Trauma Recovery Center model, right? That has been really powerful because it allows individuals to self-identify as victims. In most communities that you're living in, you have to actually go through the police department or the prosecutor's office to be deemed a victim, to even apply for victim services, right? To get support. But the Trauma Recovery Center model allows residents to self-identify as victims. You can enroll into 16 sessions and begin to receive services on the front end. But one of the things that we discovered from the study is that after 10 years of data, that those who get services on the front end are more likely to cooperate with law enforcement on the back end, right? And so where there's no relationship present, right, in terms of like law enforcement responding to a DV situation, you want to have a relationship with the local CBI organization or community-based public safety agency, because you can almost guarantee, like for NCST, we employ 50 people. 100% of our staff are residents of the neighborhoods in which they serve. We know everybody and their mama, literally, you know? And so when things come up, we can make a call real quick and intervene in a situation and mediate that conflict, and then provide kind of ongoing support services, whether it be, you know, therapeutic services, or sometimes people are just not ready, you know, for kind of like the deep talk, and we can just kind of continue to be in conversation with them so that we can actually help to try to mediate the situation if it goes left again.
Let me just add one thing too. In Milwaukee, they have they use something called the 414 blueprint, and part of their Office of Violence Prevention has a department specifically for CV. So some comprehensive violence preventions or CVI systems understand the importance of having a department just for DV. However, it goes back to, I apologize, but it goes back to how much you're funding, how much resources you have. Because in a perfect world, we would love to have people to deal with just DV, but also even what about also sexual crimes or violence, sexual violence. It's when you begin to able to bring in to compartmentalize and deal with the different types of violence, the cost changes because you need a more robust staff. Of course, now the effectiveness is greater, but that's why we're working with the White House, and we need the funding, because we understand that violence is more broad than just gun violence, and these other smaller things which aren't on the radar right now are the precursors that lead to gun violence. So we want to be able to give, you know, a department that deals specifically with domestic violence, because then we could deal with situations when the arguments get out of hand before something physical happens. And as we stated before, it's so critical to deal with the trauma and the mental health piece, because at the root, a lot of times of the domestic violence, the individuals involved have suffered a severe amount of trauma, and that's an expression of the trauma they are going through. They've been triggered. So if we could deal with those individuals while they're going through these traumatic phases, we won't have to deal with them on the aftermath when it's done reached the threshold of a criminal act.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Tunman. Thank you, Akila. We're getting towards the end, so I'm going to close out a little bit now. I really appreciate kind of this expansion, idea of expansion of what violence and victimization is at the end, because I think it points to the importance of looking beyond just our institution to define what problems are and going to the community and recognizing that victimization takes many forms. It includes people who are shot or assaulted, but it also includes people who feel that they can't walk out of their house at night because of what's going on, and being responsive to that. And, you know, I think illustrative of the institutional approach would talk about data and landscape analysis. And too often, I think our police departments and prosecutors rely specifically on crime data. We have to understand that the vast majority of crimes in this country are never reported. So when we talk about crime data, we're talking about just a sample. And there's not a reason to believe that it's a representative sample, because there are neighborhoods in which reporting is even lower, right? So the necessity of going out and finding other ways to determine what are the problems we're facing and what are the components of those problems. So I'm going to decline my spam call and keep talking here. again, thank you so much, Akila. Thank you so much, Dr. Tunman. I want to close out. I know for all of us, it's been a really difficult year, right? Seeing protests and distrust for law enforcement and the criminal justice system and cries for defunding the police, for example. And even for me internally in my organization, questions asked, why do you work with police, right? Why do you work with DOJ? Well, we know that in neighborhoods and communities where people are victimized by violence, people don't want the police to go, right? The overwhelming lesson from my career in that regard is the sentiment I think that is always expressed to me is like, yes, we are victimized by law enforcement here, but in a neighborhood without power, without resources, we're going to be victimized by somebody, right? And if you leave, we're going to be victimized by worse people, right? So we don't want you to leave. We want you to be different. And so I would ask anybody who is on this call today and working with a justice agency, like, think about a different approach to crime and safety and victimization and how we can prevent it, and would leave you with the question, how are you going to be different? So that's it for today. Thank you so much for everybody. There's some questions we didn't get to. We'll follow up for all of them. We'll provide some resources, including some more specific definitions and typologies of programs. There is a question about support for the U.S. Virgin Islands, which Brandy will probably be better to answer, but I will volunteer technical assistance services in St. Croix if you need them. Everybody have a great Wednesday, and thank you so much for your attention. Brandy,
thank you.
did you want to close out?
Thank you, everyone. And so just to close, I just want to thank the presenters. Really appreciate your time. We will definitely get out the webinar link when it's available. I also want to make sure participants knew that training and technical assistance through BJ's National Training and Technical Assistance Center is available. I'm going to put that in the chat box now so you can have a link to access that TTA. And this is available for non-federal agency participants. And so we ask that for the participants that are still on, we just want to make sure that you fill out, let us know how we did today, and fill out the training evaluation. That'll follow after the session today. And just another reminder, we'll be hosting 2 webinars on August 3rd from 2 to 3:15 Eastern Time on community-based violence intervention existing programs, and August 10th from 2 to 3:15 Eastern Time on community-based violence intervention, management of programs, staff, and relationship. And that'll get into a little bit more of the safety challenges that of some of the staffing issues that we see with some of our CVI initiatives. So that's it. I appreciate everyone's time today, and thank you again to our speakers.